It really strikes me how some things just, they don't really change, do they? I was reading this anecdote about Warren Buffett back in the '08 crisis. Everything felt so uncertain then.
Oh, yeah, I remember that feeling.
Right. And a friend asked him, how could things possibly get back to normal? And Buffett just asks, what was the top-selling candy bar in 1962? Snickers.
Snickers. Okay.
Then he asks, what is it today? Still Snickers. And that just perfectly captures what we're diving into today, this surprisingly consistent core of human behavior and the lessons it holds, even when everything else seems to be changing constantly.
Exactly. And we've gathered some really fascinating insights on this, mainly drawing from Morgan Housel's audiobook, Same as Ever. Think of this as, well, your guide to understanding what really sticks around, what persists through all the chaos.
So the goal for you, the learner, is to sort of pull out these key threads about human nature, right? The things that help make sense of the past, the present, maybe even give us a clue about the future.
Yeah, but without getting bogged down in just, endless information. We want actionable knowledge. We'll be looking at things like risk, our expectations, the power of a good story, and, frankly, our own limits in understanding it all.
Okay, so where do we start? These constants.
Oh, well, first off, the fact that predicting the future seems almost impossible, even for the experts.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's that weird link between how happy we feel and what we expect, and how those goalposts just keep moving.
Right. And why stories grab us so much more than, say, a spreadsheet. Plus, the pitfalls of only looking at the numbers, that whole cycle of greed and fear. Ready.
Let's do it. Let's start with that prediction puzzle. You'd think, with all of history to look back on, we'd get better at seeing what's coming.
You really would.
But the sources we looked at, they really hammer home how often even the most informed people are just completely blindsided. Take the Great Depression. Robert Shiller, the Nobel laureate, pointed out that basically no one saw it coming.
Nobody. That's incredible. A decade-long global catastrophe. And just before it hit, you had Irving Fisher, another famous economist, saying stock prices were on a permanently high plateau.
Wow. Talk about getting it wrong. Hindsight is definitely 20/20 there.
And it's not just some old historical thing either. Think about The Economist magazine, their predictions for 2020, not a whisper about COVID-19.
Totally. Missed it completely.
Yep. And their 2022 outlook totally overlooked Russia invading Ukraine. These are stark reminders, The biggest risks are often the ones completely off our radar.
Which feeds into this unsettling idea, doesn't it? That the real danger is the thing you didn't even think to worry about. The transcript had that sobering story about the NASA astronaut, Victor Prather.
Oh, yeah, testing the spacesuit.
Exactly. High-altitude balloon test, went perfectly, lands in the ocean, all planned. But then during the recovery, just a routine part, he slips. His faceplate was open for a second.
And water rushed in. He drowned. After all that planning, all that focus on the big risks of space travel.
It's mind-boggling. All the complex systems worked, but this tiny, unforeseen detail.
It just shows how fragile things can be. And the sources link that to something more down to earth, but equally tragic. The Squaw Valley avalanche in 2001.
Right, there was a smaller slide earlier that day.
Yeah, and it was kind of dismissed. Later, 2 skiers went under the ropes, got caught in a massive one, buried. And the detail that really sticks is their ski boots were still in the locker room.
Chilling. They absolutely expected to come back.
Total shock. It wasn't on their risk list for that moment, which leads to that quote from Carl Richards.
Risk is what's left over after you think you've thought of everything.
Exactly. That captures it perfectly.
Yeah.
It's not just about ticking off the known threats. It's acknowledging that huge space of the unknown.
So practically speaking, does this mean we should maybe spend less energy trying to predict every specific threat and more on just being resilient, ready for anything?
I think that's a big part of it, which, interestingly, leads us somewhere else entirely. Happiness. And how it's maybe less about our actual situation.
And more about our expectations.
Exactly. The sources suggest our happiness is really tied to how things stack up against what we expected or what we've known before.
Yeah, that really hit home for me. The transcript mentioned Ben Fence's parents escaping the Holocaust, arriving here practically frozen on a ship. And they were just overjoyed. Despite hardship compared to what they'd been through, America was incredible. Their baseline was just so different.
Absolutely. Or the friend who grew up in, real poverty in Africa, now working in tech in California, still amazed by grocery stores full of food.
Things we just take completely for granted.
It shows how our past shapes that baseline. But then you have the flip side, right? Like Gary Kremen, founder of Match.com, worth $10 million in Silicon Valley.
Which is objectively a huge amount of money.
Globally, yes. But there, he felt like nobody. He's constantly comparing himself to others, pushing for more.
It brings Charlie Munger's point to mind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That it's not just greed driving the world, it's envy, too. We measure ourselves against our neighbors, our peers.
And that constantly shifts the goalposts. What felt like a dream yesterday becomes today's normal, and we're looking for the next thing.
So even huge success, like fame, doesn't guarantee happiness if it just meets what you thought would happen.
Right. The transcript mentioned Naomi Osaka, the tennis star. Winning majors eventually just felt like relief, not joy. But then you have someone like Harry Truman. Expectations were super low when he became president. So when he did okay, people thought he was great. Low expectations helped him.
It really underscores that gap, the space between expectation and reality. And Peter Kaufman's point about value.
Applause sharp.
We guard our money, our stuff, because we know the price. But things like expectations, relationships, freedom, they don't have price tags, so we neglect them.
Even though they're arguably more valuable for our actual well-being. Which kind of flows into the next idea. Why some things stick in our minds, why stories are so powerful.
Right, compared to just facts and figures.
The sources really dig into this, how a compelling narrative just blows raw data out of the water in terms of impact.
Oh, definitely. Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah.
The transcript points out the most famous part, the I Have a Dream bit itself.
Wasn't even planned.
Exactly. Ahalia Jackson called out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And he just went off script, spoke from the heart. And that's the part that changed history.
It shows the sheer power of narrative, doesn't it? Connecting emotionally in a way facts alone just can't. The sources also mentioned Mark Twain reading his stuff aloud to his family.
Yeah, and cutting anything that made them lose interest.
Ruthlessly. He knew people remember sentences, killer lines, not whole books necessarily. He focused on engagement.
And it's not always about presenting brand new information, is it?
Yeah.
Look at Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens.
Right. Some reviewers were like, is this really that original?
But Harari himself admitted it wasn't all new stuff. He just wove it together brilliantly, made it accessible, told a great story.
And it became a global phenomenon. Same with Ken Burns, The Civil War. Tons of books on the topic, right? But his documentary with the music, the storytelling, it reached millions.
Or Bill Bryson's anatomy book. He didn't discover anything new. He just made existing knowledge engaging, even funny.
It's the narrative skill, which maybe explains why we remember the Titanic sinking about 1,500 lives lost, tragically.
Yeah, it's etched in our memory.
But other shipwrecks, some with far higher death tolls, have just faded away. They didn't have the same potent story, the luxury, the drama, the movie.
So the best story often wins, regardless of the objective significance.
It seems that way. Which brings us neatly to the limits of just looking at numbers, relying only on what we can measure.
Ah, yes. The danger of ignoring the unquantifiable human stuff.
Exactly. The sources warn against that. Think about Robert McNamara in Vietnam.
The data guy. Body counts, metrics.
Right. Trying to run the war like a spreadsheet. But Edward Lansdale pointed out the huge missing piece. The feelings, the perspective of the Vietnamese people. You can't chart that.
And ultimately that unquantifiable element was decisive, wasn't it?
Profoundly. There's that quote from the University of Chicago about, the limits of knowledge you can't measure, which is fair.
But the danger is assuming that if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter.
Precisely. Jeff Bezos had that great observation. When the anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes are often right. Maybe your measurement is flawed.
That definitely applies in finance, too. Jim Grant's point about markets.
Yeah, not just being about earnings and interest rates, but also emotions, sentiment, tribalism, stuff that doesn't show up on a Bloomberg terminal.
Like Lehman Brothers collapsing when the numbers looked okay, or the whole GameStop saga.
Totally irrational if you only look at the data, but the sources argue that the people who really succeed long-term, they kind of get the absurdity, the messiness of the real world.
Like John Nash, the brilliant mathematician who also believed aliens were sending him messages.
Yeah, it's a weird reminder that even logical minds can hold illogical beliefs. There are forces beyond pure reason.
Okay, so we've got flawed predictions, shifting happiness, powerful stories, limits of measurement. What about those cycles? Greed and fear.
Ah, yes, the perpetual pendulum. The sources describe it well. Good times feel permanent, so we get complacent.
Ignore the warning signs.
Until, bam, bad news hits, panic sets in. Then we assume the bad times are forever, miss the green shoots.
And the cycle starts all over again when things eventually improve.
It never stops. And Hyman Minsky's idea, the financial instability hypothesis, is so relevant here.
That stability breeds instability. How does that work?
Well, when things are calm and predictable for a long time, people get optimistic. They borrow more, take more risks.
Because it feels safe.
Exactly. But that very risk-taking makes the whole system more fragile, more vulnerable when a shock eventually does come.
Like that hypothetical example.
Yeah.
A stock market that never goes down. Sounds great, right?
Initially. But everyone would pile in, borrow to the hilt to invest more, prices go crazy.
Creating a massive bubble just waiting to pop, the lack of short-term bumps creates the potential for a huge crash later.
Precisely. And it's so easy to think, oh, but this time is different.
Yeah, Kelly Hayes' point. Everything feels unprecedented if you haven't studied history. We forget these cycles repeat.
And good times make us complacent about warnings, too. Think about pandemic preparedness. Experts warned for years.
But many didn't really listen until COVID actually hit. We were caught flat-footed.
It's like Carl Jung's idea, in antiodromia, an excess of one thing creates its opposite, like the pendulum swinging back.
The California drought example illustrates that, right? Severe drought, then record rain.
Which then fueled massive wildfires because there was so much vegetation growth. The solution to one problem created the fuel for the next.
It's a constant balancing act. And that advice Denzel Washington gave Will Smith.
At your highest moment, be careful. That's when the devil comes for you. Speaks volumes about vulnerability at the peak.
Or Jerry Seinfeld ending his show when it was still #1.
Right. He didn't want to ride the inevitable decline, a rare awareness of that ebb and flow.
Okay, so we see these cycles. But what about our push for progress? That desire to get things done fast? The transcript talks about the problem of too much too soon.
Yeah, it cautions against trying to rush things that just naturally take time. Buffett's analogy about making a baby.
You can't get one baby in 1 month with 9 women.
Exactly. Some processes just have their own pace. But interestingly, the sources also argue that big breakthroughs often come out of tough times.
When the pressure's on. When doing nothing is clearly not an option.
Precisely. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is such a grim but powerful example.
Horrific. Workers trapped, inadequate safety.
But the outrage spurred massive change. Francis Perkins, the labor movement, it led to real reforms down the line. Sometimes tragedy is the catalyst.
It makes you think about early reactions to things like cars or planes.
Yeah, the focus was often on immediate uses, like war, not the huge societal shifts they'd eventually cause.
And the sources mention stress actually helping focus. That soldier wanting to stay afraid in combat.
Right, to avoid carelessness, necessity, or even fear can really drive innovation and sharp thinking.
Which brings us to the 1930s. The Great Depression, devastating, obviously.
Absolutely.
But the transcript points out it was also an incredibly productive decade in the U.S. Huge infrastructure projects, rural electrification, supermarkets, laundromats.
Amazing productivity gains, technological leaps, all happening amidst terrible economic hardship. It shows how challenges can force progress.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. What about staying ahead? Competitive advantage. The sources say it rarely lasts, right?
That's a key theme. Most advantages, no matter how strong they seem, eventually fade. T. Boone Pickens had that list of why.
The 5 big things. Let's see. Overconfidence.
Yep. Thinking you're invincible, then the sheer difficulty of managing growth.
Then wanting to relax once you've made it.
Understandable, but dangerous. Plus skills becoming obsolete and just plain old luck running out.
You see it everywhere in business. Those huge companies listed GM, Kodak, Sears, GE, once untouchable, now bankrupt or totally transformed.
Or shifts in global power. Nothing stays on top forever. It reminds me of the Red Queen idea from biology.
You have to keep running just to stay in the same place.
Exactly. Even ancient species aren't guaranteed survival. Extinction risk doesn't really decrease with age. You need constant effort, constant adaptation to maintain any edge.
No resting on laurels, whether you're a species or a company or just, well, us.
Absolutely. Constant effort is key.
So maintaining an edge is hard. But looking forward, the transcript also says we tend to underestimate what's coming. The future wonders.
Yes. There's this pattern with new technologies. First dismissal, then maybe fear, then eventually total dependence. We're often skeptical early on.
Like Thomas Edison back in 1908, already a giant, but saying the real inventions were still ahead.
He was confident. And innovation often isn't one big eureka moment, right? It's usually lots of small discoveries building on each other.
Like a book being more than just the words, it's what the reader brings to.
Good analogy. Or a new text potential going way beyond what the inventor first imagined. The sources talk about emergent effects.
Like cool air plus warm breeze equals tornado. Boring thing plus boring thing, world-changing thing.
Something like that. Two simple things combine to create something complex and powerful, and we struggle with that, especially exponential growth.
Albert Bartlett's point about humans just not getting exponential functions intuitively.
It applies beyond finance too, right? Compounding in careers, skills. Mediocre skills combined over time can lead to huge success.
Okay, now this next one feels very real. The gap between how things look and how they actually are. Harder than it looks, not as fun as it seems.
Oh, yeah. The transcript highlights how we tend to hide our struggles, our insecurities, James Baldwin's idea that our pain connects us.
But we rarely show it.
Generally not. We project confidence, happiness, like that commercial artist who seemed to make easy money. The reality is usually way more effort.
And incentives play a huge role here, twisting our behavior.
Massively. People can justify almost anything if the incentive is strong enough. Remember the pizza guy turned subprime mortgage banker?
Yeah, knew it was shady, but the money was too good.
Exactly. It highlights that pull. And the parable of the villager with the telescope.
Seeing what he wants to see, ignoring the evidence, we all do that, don't we?
It's human nature. Henry Luce, realizing pure objectivity was basically impossible, led him to create Time magazine, focused on telling a concise story, not finding absolute truth.
And that conflict between knowing what's right versus the incentives and feels like investing, law, medicine.
Yeah, the bias towards doing something even if inaction is better because action gets rewarded or is expected. We overestimate others' objectivity and underestimate how much incentives drive our own views.
Which leads right into the power of personal experience. Nothing teaches, like, living through something, does it?
The sources argue it's the most powerful persuader. Truman's quote about the next generation needing a hammer of experience.
You can tell them, but they need to feel it. Like the shift in attitudes during the Great Depression. Dire circumstances change minds fast.
Absolutely. And we can't really predict how we'd react to future events because we can't imagine the changed context. Like trying to imagine reacting to a market crash today versus how you'd actually feel if it happened and your whole outlook shifted.
Chris Rock's joke about bullies being half of what you learn in school.
Yeah, that real-world navigation of uncertainty and even amazing experiences like walking on the moon.
Aldrin versus Conrad's reactions show it can become normalized fast. Expectations adjust.
And success often doesn't bring the happiness people expect, like Jim Carrey said. You get there and realize it wasn't the answer. Other life challenges persist.
So our experiences are key. What about thinking long-term? Is it just about having a long timeline?
Not quite. The sources say real long-term thinking requires flexibility, adaptability. Elizabeth Taylor's quote about her marriage lasting days before divorce.
Huh. A good reminder of how unpredictable things are.
Right. And patience can look like stubbornness if you refuse to adapt when things change. You need to know the few things that don't change and update everything else.
And having a flexible end date for strategies is important, not a fixed point that could get hit by bad luck.
Exactly. Think margin of safety, like Benjamin Graham taught. Or Keynes saying we're all dead in the long run plan needs wiggle room.
And this perspective should change how we consume information. Focus on the permanent knowledge, human behavior.
Over the expiring stuff, the daily news cycle, foundational knowledge compounds.
Okay, nearly there. What about complexity? We seem drawn to it sometimes.
Yeah, the sources suggest we sometimes value difficulty for its own sake. Overlook simple, effective solutions. Harold Varmus on the war on cancer.
Decades of progress, complex treatments, but still huge challenges.
It illustrates that complexity doesn't guarantee success, or the medical professor diagnosing rare diseases over common ones.
That fascination with the intricate. But there are no extra points for difficulty, right?
Yeah.
Simple often works best.
Often, yes. Which brings us to the final, really powerful point, scars. Mental, emotional scars.
The idea that wounds heal, but scars last.
Exactly. They shape us, our perspectives, our behavior long after the event is over. Think about security after 9/11 at the Pentagon versus Reagan Airport.
Visible, physical scars on the landscape reflecting the psychological ones.
And different life experiences create different scars, different ways of thinking. Why logical arguments sometimes fail. People are coming from fundamentally different places shaped by their past.
So disagreements often aren't about intelligence, but about different histories.
Very often. The sources give examples. WWII on the Eastern Front, post-war Japan, the Great Depression generation. These events left deep, lasting marks, even after recovery. People became more cautious, valued security more.
And we can't easily measure those internal states, moods, fears, hopes, which adds to the unpredictability.
Right. It's like Pavlov's dog's experiences create deep associations that drive future behavior, often unconsciously.
So the final question the sources leave us with is,
What have you experienced that I haven't that makes you believe what you do? And maybe, would I think like you if I'd lived through your experiences? It reframes disagreement.
it really does. So wrapping this deep dive up, the big takeaway is, despite constant change, human nature is remarkably consistent. The challenges of prediction, the relativity of happiness, the power of stories, the limits of data, the cycles of boom and bust, these things persist.
And hopefully, for you, the learner, exploring this gives you some truly useful tools. Think about how these timeless patterns around risk, expectations, experience apply to your own life, your own challenges. Maybe reflect on your own assumptions, where they came from.
Because ultimately, understanding the things that stay same as ever is maybe the best way to navigate a future that's guaranteed to be full of change. The specific details evolve, but the underlying human drivers, they're likely to shape our story for a long time to come.